Rachel's already introduced myself. I'm in the Human Dimensions of Natural Resources Department at CSU, and I'm trained as an environmental economist. And I want to acknowledge some of my other co-authors on the work I'm going to be presenting today. First, we have Brett Walk, who's the assistant director at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University, and he's also on this call today. And he really spearheaded this project and this collaboration with Denver Water and the U.S. Forest Service to do this economic assessment of one of their partnerships that I'm going to be discussing. Also had Ben Gannon, who was at CFRI at the time as well, who was really instrumental in doing the modeling you're going to hear me talking about, the biophysical modeling, and especially around wildfire and hydrology. And then Thomas Timberlake from the Forest Service joined us in this project towards the end and was really helpful in helping us contextualize our results for policy and program management. And then Luke Chamberlain was a master's student of mine during this assessment and helped with data collection and data analysis. So with that, I'm going to get started discussing what we learned from evaluating the $60 million that Denver Water and U.S. Forest Service spent to protect Denver's water supply. So our question is, did it work? So I'm going to start with some broad background and our study objectives. So I think everyone on this call is pretty familiar with the increase in wildfires that we're seeing across the United States, both in frequency, as this table on the left shows. We're seeing increasing amounts of acres burned with a 10-year average of about 1.2 million acres burned per year. And if you look at the numbers for 2022, we've already surpassed that, and we're just over halfway through our year. So more and more, if you live in the Western US, you're seeing images like this one, which I got to experience during a backpacking trip in Colorado when the largest wildfire in Colorado's history started, the Cameron Peak Fire. And we're also really familiar with the intensity of these wildfires when they occur. So while these ecosystems are adapted to fire, and fire is a natural part of the system, the way we're seeing wildfires burn is at much higher severity intensity. So we're seeing these denuded landscapes, all the vegetation is being removed, we're getting hydrophobic soils, and this is leading to consequences for our ecosystems and for humans and the values that we derive from these ecosystems. So many values at risk are threatened by these extreme wildfire events that are occurring more frequently. Just a few of those include loss of homes, property, and lives, public health effects, the lost recreation opportunities, and loss of biodiversity. And one of the biggest ones we're seeing in the Western US is these source water impacts. And this can include everything from loss of reservoir capacity to increased water treatment costs, damaging built infrastructure, and just the rehabilitation costs post-fire. Both of these images are from post-fire flood events that happened in Colorado after recent wildfires. So what needs to happen to reverse these trends? Well, we need more proactive fuel treatments and forest restoration on our landscapes. And this can include things like thinning, prescribed fire, other best management practices. A recent report released by the Nature Conservancy summed up that the Forest Service has estimated that we need about 51 million acres of fuel treatments across all land tenure types in the United States. And if we were to do this, we would need $5 to $6 billion per year over the next 10 years. That's not what we're currently investing in fuel treatment and forest restoration. So how do we scale this financing up and scale this work up on the ground? Well, some of the ways that this report brainstorms is that we need to continue to invest in our federal programs and increase funding to those federal programs, and we could add state programs there as well. But we also need more innovative sources of financing to get this work done. This can include things like environmental impact bonds and partnerships with utilities and private industries. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today in our work. These funders, especially the last two, these partnerships with utilities, industry, environmental impact bonds, expect and need information on the types of outcomes and benefits that they will see from investing in these proactive fuel treatments. So they need to go beyond acres treated and really understand those outcomes. And they need to understand where and how much they need to be investing on the landscape. So this can come in the form of risk reduction metrics, avoided costs and economic assessments, and assessments of the potential revenues from investing in these proactive management strategies. So the study that I'm going to present today really responds to that need for more measurement and quantification of outcomes and benefits. And so what we've done is we've conducted an economic assessment, a cost-benefit analysis to be specific, for Denver Water and the USDA Forest Services From Forest to Faucets Partnership. So F2F is the acronym I'll use for that today. And this partnership was one of the original partnerships that's been highlighted a lot in a lot of the literature about investments in wildfire mitigation. It began in 2010. And there have been a handful of economic assessments, including of this partnership, that look forward and say, where should you invest your fuel treatments? And if you put your fuel treatments in this place, what will be the benefits and outcomes? So these prospective types of economic assessments can be really useful for targeting where you should put fuel treatments on the ground. What we do in this assessment and this analysis is different, is we look at what's already been done by the F2F partnership. So we're looking retrospectively on where they made their fuel treatment investments, and we're doing an economic assessment of what are the actual benefit and outcomes that came from those investments. And this is important because while it's easy to look ahead and say this is where you should do your fuel treatments, by looking at actual investments, we can look at the realities on the ground of where people are actually able to implement these investments due to constraints, due to trade-offs, due to negotiations, and say what is actually accomplished with this money. A second objective that we wanted to carry out in this assessment is we want to go beyond looking at source water protection, which is of course very important to Denver Water and water utilities, and bring in a wider range of values at risk. So source water protection, of course, is important, but there's also other environmental and community values that are important to Denver Water, to the U.S. Forest Service, and to other end users in this watershed. So these co-benefits are also included in our assessment. So let me talk about the study area and methods. So as I said, the F2F partnership is between Denver Water and U.S. Forest Service and started in 2010. And the goal of this partnership has been to strategically invest in those proactive fuel treatments and post-fire recovery in the watersheds that feed Denver Water's water collection system. And we're looking specifically at the first 5-year agreements. We're just over $60 million through this partnership. So this map on the right shows you our study area. There in the black boundary are the north and south water collection systems for Denver Water. We used a 5-mile buffer around this collection system. And over 60% of the area in the study area is national forest. So we have 3 main national forests represented in different shades of green here. And we also have in maroon what are referred to as these zones of concern. So these were areas that had been previously identified by Denver Water because of their importance to water supply. And so a lot of the investments in fuel treatments through this partnership have been made within these zones of concern. As you can see, our fuel treatment colors are red and orange. A lot of them fall in these maroon boundaries. So our study area involves these different fuel treatments, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So the first thing we had to do is we had to gather the data on what had been invested through this F2F partnership. And this was no easy task, and I'll come back to that and kind of lessons learned and conclusions, but the partnership only kept track of non-spatial complements. So we didn't have any GIS data spatially on where they were making their investments. But we knew from their records that they had done about 50,000 acres between 2011 and 2019. So we actually did this study in 2019, 2020. So we only were able to go up to 2019. To get spatial data on where the partnership invested, we had to go to the national forest to get those fuel treatment sites or polygons. And then we had to supplement that with the U.S. Forest Service's FACTS database. So we were able to do that, and I'll talk about the data we got on fuel treatments here, but we weren't able to get the about 2,000 acres that the partnership had treated on non-federal lands. So our assessment is only looking at the federal acres treated through this partnership. And so this table shows of those acres by canopy type and surface fuel type in italics, where or what types of treatments we had. We have a total of just over 63,000 acres treated in the full study area, so that 3.8 million acres. And then in those maroon zones of concern, we had 27,000 acres treated. So that's not in addition to the 63,000, that's of the 63,000 in the zones of concern. So that was an area, like I said, that was prioritized for those treatments. So we have different types of treatment types, and we're able to use that in our assessment in terms of how it's going to influence wildfire risk. And then for that field treatment data, we use a 25-year treatment effectiveness period. And this is longer than some other studies have used in the literature, but this is based on some recent science done by CFRI in the study region. And then the partnership did not keep track of how much they spent per treatment type. Another point I'll come back to in lessons learned. So we went to the literature, and based on our connections in the region of people doing fuel treatments, we used $1,000 per acre fuel treatment cost to represent all acres treated, because we have different variations in treatment type, different variations in the cost, but we use this average amount across the full study. So we adopted this wildfire risk assessment framework to do our analysis. And so wildfire risk can be thought of as the product of the likelihood of an event occurring and the consequences if that event occurs. And so within this wildfire risk framework, we are using fuel treatments as having an influence on wildfire intensity. So we're not letting fuel treatment, or we're not assuming that fuel treatment affects wildfire likelihood or wildfire spread, but that if a fire occurs where fuel treatments have taken place, that it will alter the severity or intensity of fire. And this is based on recent science. So we conduct this wildfire risk assessment both baseline before any treatments occurred in the partnership, so 2011, and then after treatments occurred over this 25-year treatment effectiveness period. And we do this for 4 different scenarios. So 4 might sound like a lot. And the reason we did this is because there's, of course, a lot of complexity in wildfire science, and we wanted to take that into account and show a range of possible outcomes from making these proactive field treatments. So our 4 scenarios capture different assumptions around wildfire likelihood and wildfire intensity. So I'll just summarize these quickly. For likelihood, we had a scenario for conditional and expected. Conditional assumes that where the fuel treatments happen, a wildfire occurs over our 25-year treatment effectiveness period. Expected uses modeling. It uses the large fire simulator and burn probability to say this is where we expect to see wildfires on our landscape over these 25 years, and whether we would expect it to occur in the areas where the fuel treatments were put. And then for wildfire intensity, we also had 2 different scenarios. We had assumed and modeled. For assumed, we assumed that where fuel treatments were put, that they would lower fire severity by 1 level. So this is giving the manager the benefit of the doubt that they put the right fuel treatment in, and it's going to have an influence on fire severity. For modeled, we used FLAM map and proportional adjustment factors to say, okay, if this type of fuel treatment, if it was thinning or prescribed burning or clear cutting, using those proportional adjustment factors, this is how much the fire intensity would be reduced based on the baseline fuel conditions in that area. So this gives us our 4 scenarios, and you can think of them as bookends, where scenario 1 is kind of the most optimistic in terms of the benefits that the fuel treatments can bring to the values at risk. And scenario 4 is the more conservative or pessimistic in terms of the fuel treatments being in the right place where a fire is going to occur, and then reducing that fire intensity to protect those values at risk. So that was our wildfire risk assessment analysis, and we need to connect that then to the values at risk, or the benefits or avoided costs from doing these field treatments. So to get a list of the benefits or values at risk that are important to this partnership, we sat down with Denver Water, and then we had follow-up conversations with the Forest Service in this region to ask them what's important to you when you do these field treatments. And you can see in this table all the possible values at risk that they came up with, and the ones in bold are the ones that we felt we had the data and the capacity to include in our economic assessment. So of course, source water protection came up as a very important value at risk, and that includes many different things. That includes that reservoir protection from sedimentation, protection of their hydropower generation, their water treatability, and recreation within their reservoirs. But they also came up with a lot of community and environmental co-benefits that motivate them to do these field treatments. And that included everything from protecting private property to reducing suppression costs to public health impacts and wildlife protection. So again, we weren't able to include a couple of these, especially the public health impacts and carbon storage and sequestration, that probably would have high economic value, but we didn't have the data to include in our assessment. So we take this wildfire risk assessment framework that I just went over, and we connected that to models that help us get at the source water protection risk and help us get at co-benefit risk due to changes with and without the field treatments that influence this wildfire intensity variable. So I'll talk about where the data come from for each of these values at risk on the next few slides. So for the source water protection, to estimate the economic value, we first had to do our biophysical modeling. So we were able to do two different types of kind of hydrological models. The first was to look at total sediment delivered to reservoirs and diversion points. And this was done using models of hill slope erosion and sediment delivery ratios. And there's a good explanation in detail of that in a paper by one of the co-authors on this work. And then to connect that to the economic value to our stakeholders, we used a two-step process where we sat down and had focus group meetings with several staff members from Denver Water. So first, what we did with the Denver Water staff is we had them go through each of their infrastructure components and rank them in terms of their importance to three things: water treatment, operations, which includes their reservoirs and hydroelectricity, and stewardship, which captures the water-based recreation. So they ranked them between 0 and 100. And then we had them tell us how much they've spent during past wildfire events on these three aspects of source water protection. And the maximum monetary amount that we came to over those three types of source water protection was $150 per cubic meter. So we then multiplied the relative importance of each infrastructure component by $150 per cubic meter to give us that range between $2 and $150 per cubic meter, depending on the infrastructure that was influenced by wildfire. So this is an average value of about $39 per cubic meter as the economic value of preventing sedimentation in the water in the Denver water system. We did a similar process for debris flow that affects their conveyance infrastructure. So first, biophysically, we use debris flow models, a USGS debris flow model, and a channel sediment delivery ratio to calculate how much debris flow would occur with and without field treatments. And then with those focus group discussions with Denver Water, they estimated a constant rate of $20 per cubic meter for their expenditures after debris flow after past wildfire events. So that was used for our source water protection economic values. So while we're able to get those primary economic values for source water protection, for those co-benefits, we had to use secondary data. So we had to go to the literature to get the economic values and to draw on different biophysical models and data sources. So first, to get at kind of infrastructure, both private property, houses, and the Denver water utility buildings, we used a home loss model, which estimates the probability of a house being lost to a wildfire using different landscape characteristics. And we used that with the median housing value in the study area. And also we were able to get the value of assets directly from Denver Water for their infrastructure buildings that would be impacted by wildfire. For the suppression cost estimates in our economic assessment, we used from the literature an estimate that about 23% of areas so there's about a 23% reduction in suppression costs for areas that have received fuel treatments, and that extends to about a 2-mile buffer around where those fuel treatments occurred. So we use that to get the area that would be protected by fuel treatments, and then we use from the literature an economic estimate of the average suppression cost in the US. For rehabilitation costs, we were only able to capture replanting after severe wildfire events. So again, we got the area burned in active crown fire as a proxy for high severity fire. And we assumed that these would need to be replanted because natural regeneration wouldn't occur in these areas. And then we used an economic value of about $500 per acre, which came from the US Forest Service. And then for hiking trails, which represents kind of the value at risk for recreation, we approximated or measured the length of trails that would overlap with those high severity fires in our study area. And then we used an estimate of $60,000 US per mile of trail in terms of the economic value of restoring those trails if they were affected by wildfire. And this comes from different US Forest Service data on trail maintenance and repair, combined with information on willingness to pay to hike in Colorado that comes from a benefit transfer database put together by USGS. And then for wildlife, we looked at several different wildlife species, and in the end, we were only able to include one in our assessment that we knew would be impacted by a wildfire event in the study area. And that was the Pawnee mountain montane skipper, which is a butterfly species that occurs in the area and has been impacted in the past by wildfire events. So again, we took the area that we expected would be burned under our scenarios with and without the fuel treatments as the biophysical data. And then we used from the literature an estimate of $100 US per acre value for endangered species. So we used all of this and we were able to calculate the different economic value, avoided costs for these different co-benefits, as well as the source water protection that we just talked about. And then we bring this all together into our economic assessment. So for all the costs and benefits, all those economic dollar amounts that we just talked about, we converted them first to 2011 US dollars, since that's the baseline or starting period for our assessment. And then for the treatment costs that occurred between 2011 and 2019, we distribute them evenly over that 9-year period. For all of the benefits, source water protection, all those co-benefits, we summed them up and we spread them evenly over the 25-year treatment effectiveness period that we used for our study. And then we used a 3% discount rate to get those benefits and costs back to the 2011 start. And then we did our benefit cost ratio to assess the program effectiveness or efficiency. So we first summed all those benefits or avoided costs, and then we divide by the sum of all those treatment costs. And in the benefit cost ratio, the magic number is 1. So if we're greater than 1, we can say with confidence that the societal benefits exceed the cost of doing the field treatments. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty in our economic assessment and in our biophysical assessment. One of the ways that we can acknowledge that uncertainty, especially in this cost-benefit assessment, is to do a sensitivity analysis. So we also did perform a sensitivity analysis around the benefits estimates that we included. So in addition to the regular cost-benefit ratio I'll show you, we also increased the economic value of those benefits 2- and 3-fold. And the reason we did this is because, one, a lot of the economic methods we're using to put a dollar value on these values at risk are referred to as revealed preference or observed behavior methods in the economic literature. And it's known that this type of approach to put a monetary value on things is a lower bound on human demand or willingness to pay for these values. So we're acknowledging that this is kind of the lower bound. So we want to double and triple those benefits and see what would happen to our cost benefit ratio. Second, a lot of the co-benefits, we didn't have any primary data on economic value, so we had to go to the literature and kind of transfer those values from one study to our study. And then thirdly, we know we're missing some of those values at risk that were really important to our partners, and those include things like the public health benefits and the carbon storage and sequestration. So for those reasons, we show this increase in benefits as well in our results. Okay. So let me go into our results and show you what we found. So first, I just want us to look at the baseline conditions of our study area in terms of wildfire likelihood and wildfire intensity. So this map on the left shows the wildfire likelihood or the burn probability. And what you might notice, if you're looking at the legend there at the bottom, is that green is low, red is high. So significant areas in our study area have little or low burn probability, right? And this is because these are high elevation forests that have sparse fuels. So they're mostly grass and shrub dominated. And so historically, these have not burned. We know now that a lot of these are actually seeing fire due to changing climate. But in our burn probability map and in the modeling we did, so when we do the models that incorporate burn probability, the areas that are green are going to have a low probability of burning. So if you have a fuel treatment there, there's going to be a low probability that that fuel treatment is going to actually encounter a wildfire over its 25-year lifespan. So this, of course, is going to influence our economic assessment results. On the right here are the baseline conditions for wildfire intensity in our study area. And you'll see the legend here shows different crown fire activities, and we use that as a proxy for severity, where active is high severity, passive is moderate, and surface crown fire activity is low severity wildfire. So again, you'll see that there's, of course, spatial heterogeneity in our landscape due to fuel types and topography. And in those areas where you have already kind of surface or unburned fire activity, in our models that look at how a fuel treatment is going to influence wildfire intensity, if you're already at a low level of fire intensity, there's not going to be an opportunity for that fuel treatment to change the wildfire intensity. So again, this is going to influence your economic assessment results, because if you're already low, you can't go any lower if you put a fuel treatment there. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at our results. So now I want to show the summary of the economic benefits that we found for this study area due to those 9 years of proactive fuel treatments. So we have it for the full study area, and we have it for the zones of concern, those maroon areas in our study area map for the 4 scenarios. And if we look at just source water protection, again, with scenario 1 being kind of the most optimistic in terms of how fuel treatments can influence those values at risk, we see for source water protection, we have about 42 million US dollars in economic benefits over that 25-year time frame. And for co-benefits, we have about 109 million over that 25-year time frame. If you drop down to the more kind of pessimistic or conservative scenario 4, we're seeing about 4 million in benefits for source water protection and 24 million in benefits for those environmental and community stewardship co-benefits. And if we come over here to the zones of concern, remember those were specifically targeted for some of their hydrological importance, we see that the relative influence on providing economic benefits to source water protection is reflected in that. So more than half of our source water protection benefits are coming from the fuel treatments in the zones of concern, about 33 million in benefits under scenario 1, and about 3 million in benefits under scenario 4. So you can add both of those up and you get the total economic benefits that these fuel treatments are bringing to society under this partnership. But now we need to look at the comparison, of course, between the sum of these benefits and the sum of the treatment costs. So remember, in the full study area, we had about 63,000 acres of fuel treatments, about $1,000 per acre of treatment, so about $63 million of treatment costs. In the zones of concern, we had about 27,000 acres of fuel treatments. So with $1,000 per acre, about $27 million spent on the fuel treatments in the zones of concern. So here is the first graph of our benefit cost ratio with kind of our regular economic benefit assessment. And again, with 1 being kind of the magic number we're looking for, that's put in this dark black line. So under the 2 scenarios or wildfire scenarios that are conditional on fire occurring, so this is the assumption that where fuel treatments occur, fire occurs over the 25-year effectiveness period, you do see a positive benefit cost ratio for the full study area and the zones of concern. Now, you don't always see that for just source water protection alone, but you do see it if you add up source water protection and co-benefit values. For the 2 wildfire scenarios that we modeled, where a fuel treatment is going to encounter a wildfire based on that burn probability map I showed you a few slides ago, we of course do not see that the benefit cost ratio is greater than 1. So we looked, like I said, in that sensitivity analysis on what would happen if we missed some of the economic values at risk, or we underrepresented them in our monetary evaluation. So I'll just show you for the 3 times the economic benefit assessment that I talked about as one of our sensitivity analyses. And this was, full disclosure, we used the 3 to see like what would it take to get us to a positive cost benefit ratio. And it was at 3 times the economic benefits we estimated that got us to a positive or greater than 1 benefit cost ratio in all wildfire scenarios. So here, the black line representing that 1, we see that under conditional and expected fire occurrence models, we hit that 1. And so we see that in the conditional and fire occurrence, we get above 1 for just source water protection, with the co-benefits just being kind of an added societal benefit from these fuel treatments. And that for the expected fire occurrence of scenarios 3 and 4, it's the total sum of source water protection and those co-benefits that get us to that positive benefit cost ratio. All right, so let's talk about what that means and how we could do better in future studies that want to get at the economic outcomes and benefits of proactive fuel treatments. So first, going back to the question we posed, did it work? So in our report and in previous presentations that myself and Brett have given, we always say it depends on the assumptions and on your risk tolerance. But I changed it today to say, yes, it works, because I think it did work, but it still also depends on the different assumptions and the different parameters we're using in our model and your risk tolerance. So let me explain that a little bit more and when it worked and how. So we do see that this $60 million had a positive societal benefit when we consider both source water protection and the co-benefits, those environmental and community values at risk. And this is important to keep in mind. There have been other economic assessments of fuel treatments that have showed that if we just look at source water protection, that the fuel treatment costs are often higher than the benefits we get just from source water protection. So it's an important reminder that we need to be considering all the values at risk that wildfire events could create, and to try and quantify those different values at risk, and where appropriate, monetize them in these economic assessments. Second, we find that the benefit cost ratio is greater than 1, so societal benefit happens when we think about wildfire happening where the fuel treatments were placed on the landscape. So wildfire, of course, is an uncertain event. It's not going to happen across our whole study area and our whole landscape. And so we have to account for burn probability and the likelihood that a wildfire event is going to occur. Our burn probability map, as I mentioned, is probably outdated based on what we're seeing happening in Colorado and other parts of the Western US right now. We're seeing more and more fire in these high elevation forests. And so while it's not likely that all of our fuel treatments are going to encounter a wildfire over those 25 years, probably a lot of them will or could. And this also depends on your risk tolerance, right? Are you willing to take the risk of a fire occurring or not? Because when a fire does occur, it can have devastating consequences for water utilities and other downstream users. So we need to have better representation of this on where we target fuel treatments, right, to the areas that we think are going to most likely have a fire, but also recognize that this is a probabilistic event and we might not want to take that risk. Third, we find that the benefit cost ratio is highest in areas that were targeted explicitly for source water protection. So within those zones of concern, those maroon polygons that we saw in the study area map. So this makes sense and means that spatial targeting does work, right? If source water protection is a primary goal or objective of a partnership, putting fuel treatments in the areas, the process-based models can help us predict those areas where the erosion potential is highest, where debris flow potential is highest. We're going to get the biggest bang for our buck, right, in terms of its impact on protecting that water security. And then here, As I mentioned, right, we were able to get a positive benefit cost ratio for this partnership across all our modeling assumptions, even the most conservative or pessimistic about when and where wildfire is going to occur and how a fuel treatment is going to alter that wildfire intensity if the economic benefits in the study area are 3 times greater than what we estimated in our initial analysis. And again, after many discussions about our analysis and the values at risk that we were able to include, we felt pretty confident that it is likely that the benefits are higher than we estimated in our initial analysis. Because like I said, some of the methods we use, the economic methods, are really a lower bound on value. And we miss some of those important values at risk, like public health and carbon storage and sequestration. So while we're able to say, yes, we think the 9 years of investments had an impact on society in a positive way, our assessment also shows how the partnership could do better and how other investments in proactive fuel treatments could increase their economic efficiency. So first, one is to account for those biophysical processes in where we target our fuel treatments. So this includes both the burn probability I just talked about. So about 1/3 of the treatments, the fuel treatments in this partnership, were made in low severity or low wildfire intensity areas, right? So as I mentioned, when we were looking at that map, that means the fuel treatments didn't have an opportunity to actually lower fire intensity because the fire severity was already low, right? So we need to be targeting our fuel treatments in the areas that are expected to burn at high intensity. Second, back to those hydrological benefits, about 57% of the treatments in this partnership were made outside of those zones of concern. So as we showed, the zones of concern area had the highest impact on source water protection. It was almost 2 times higher than the full study area. So if that is the primary goal or objective, right, we need to target more of these treatments to those areas. That said, and we discussed this more in the report, when you do have partnerships and collaborations, there are of course trade-offs in where the treatments are going to be made to meet multiple objectives around values at risk. A second way that we could improve the efficiency of this partnership or other fuel treatments is to scale up to treat more acres. So less than 2% of our total study area was treated. That's even if we included the number of acres that they had invested in on non-federal lands. So of course, having more fuel treatments increases the probability that those fuel treatments are going to interact with a wildfire when a wildfire event happens on the landscape and be able to moderate that severity of wildfire. And then thirdly, the type of fuel treatment matters. And so in our models where we use as proportional adjustment factors, prescribed fire was the fuel treatment based on the science and the literature that reduced fire intensity the most. And only about 22% of the treatments in this study area included prescribed fire either by itself or coupled with thinning first. So if we want to increase the ability of those treatments to moderate fire severity, there needs to be more prescribed fire used in this partnership moving forward. And then more broadly, thinking about how future economic assessments can improve measuring outcomes and benefits of these proactive fuel treatments. Just a couple of takeaways from our assessment. One is that we do need to have the latest science on fire likelihood and fire intensity represented in our models. So I've talked about that throughout the presentation, that those high elevation forests, we're seeing increasing fire activity in them, which historically wasn't there. So that needs to be represented in these wildfire models. Second, we need to bring in more process-based assessments of those values at risk. So we were able to do that well with source water protection. There are a lot of other studies that are doing that really well for source water protection, but we also need to incorporate that for other values at risk like public health, carbon storage and sequestration to really understand those outcomes and benefits. And then third, we need to have better spatial accounting of our forest management activities. So that's pre and post fuel treatments on the landscape so that we can actually document changes in vegetation and fuel load that go into these models and know how fire intensity is actually reduced. We had to make a lot of assumptions in our assessment. And then we also need to record the costs we're spending on different fuel treatment types so we can do a better job of understanding the relative cost effectiveness across different fuel treatment types on the landscape. All right, with that, I just want to point you to some additional resources. If you want to learn more about the modeling framework, the data we use, and our policy recommendations, the full report has the most detail, and this can be found on CFRI's website. We also have a peer-reviewed journal article in Forest Policy and Economics that summarizes this study. And then CFRI is now producing a podcast. And Brett talked about this research and this assessment in the podcast that you see the link to here. So if you want to hear him talk about this in maybe a more compelling way than me, you can go access the podcast. And if you have any problem accessing these resources or just want more information in general, my email is here at the bottom. Feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to help. So with that, I'll turn it back to Rachel and see if we have questions or discussion. And I'll also open up if Brett, if you want to say anything that I might have missed or highlighted anything that I maybe didn't get completely, please feel free to jump in.
Great, thank you so much, Kelly. That was a wonderful presentation, and we do have some questions for you. So Jan Willem had a question, wondering if you've looked at source water area prioritization, and he's asking because not all source water areas are equally contributing to source water. So for example, areas that are beneficial to snow accumulation and infiltration are of higher value as source water areas.
And I'll take a first stab, and then Brett, if you have anything to add, please feel free. So, I mean, in this study, we used the hill slope erosion models to get at the differential impact of different areas on source water protection, really focus on sedimentation, and then of course those debris flow models. And then the zones of concern that Denver Water had already established with other scientists was also based on a prioritization due to, I think, erosion specifically. So I don't know that snowpack was part of that assessment. I don't know, Brett, if you know at all if that was considered.
Yeah, I don't know if people can hear me because I'm not presenting on the webinar. I'm seeing Kelly nod, so yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I imagine how I interpret the question, and you can jump in and clarify if needed, but you're correct. I would say correct that snow is where the majority of the quantity of the water comes from as far as where your source water comes from. And this system gets the most quantity of the water from the higher elevation where the most snow falls, but the biggest impacts have been and are predicted to be in the quality of the water, which is in the lower elevations that are more rain dominated and the lower elevation forests. So that was where the focus of our assessment was really more on the quality of the source water rather than the quantity. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Yeah, I think that's good. And Jan Willem, if you have any additional follow-up, please type it in that chat box. Sort of piggybacking on Jan Willem's question, I was wondering if you can recommend any treatment prioritization models or software which would provide a good starting point for water utilities and other land managers working together for source water protection.
I'm also going to defer to Brett. I'm just the economist, so I just put the economic values. But in terms of the modeling for prioritizing fuel treatments, Brett, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I guess one thought I wanted to add, and you highlighted the zones of concern a lot, and I saw Brad Peel from JW Associates is on, who led the development of those zones of concern in 2009. So there's lots of different ways to prioritize treatments and think about doing that. There's the national forest to faucets sort of prioritization and assessment that the Forest Service has produced, and I'd clarify that's different than this Denver Water Forest Service forest to faucets partnership. But yeah, I don't know. There's lots of tools out there. I think it's also though how you input your values into those tools. And that's, I think, a fault of a lot of those national assessments is it's hard to manipulate that national data and it's kind of stuck there. And that's where In this case, the original zones of concern developed by J Associates was sort of a collaborative effort between them and Denver Water, and where are your utilities and where are the relative risks. And that's what we're doing moving forward with Denver Water as well. So I think that's the key if you're looking at doing this, is being able to put your local values and your local landscape and that kind of stuff into whatever prioritization models you're using.
Yeah, and I guess that's what this presentation really highlights, is the nuance that feeds into it. Jay was wondering, has this study resulted in Denver Water investing more on treatments or treatment types?
Brett can probably speak to that more. I do know that our partners at Denver Water have used this to go back to their board and show the impact of their investments, and it's been very instrumental for them to negotiate a third kind of agreement with the Forest Service. But in terms of on the ground activities, Brett, do you have any more insight?
Yes, so it helped sort of justify their program, but also tweak their program. Really showed, focusing on sort of zones of concern and reevaluating, like Kelly said, connecting the biophysical processes with their specific infrastructure to refine the zones of concern moving forward. So thinking about how do you reshape the next 5 or 20 years of this program. We're actively using this data with, as Kelly mentioned, updated fire behavior, fire probability modeling to take into new climate scenarios, and sort of using that moving forward right now. So I would say it hasn't dramatically increased the amount of money they're investing. I think our analysis really confirmed their current strategy is they require a 1-to-1 match from Denver. Every dollar Denver Water puts in, the Forest Service puts in. And as Kelly showed with those cost benefit analysis, source water protection alone usually doesn't add up to a full return on investment. So, but it's still worth their while to invest for sure. So collaborating and, saying, hey, we have a big piece in this, but then the Forest Service and other people have other interests, and co-funding it, I think is really what our study helped confirm, that the model, again, that was set up is really the best sort of way to invest for everybody. Sometimes water providers people look at water providers to fund everything. And I think our study confirmed that's maybe not, they have a big role, but maybe not the only role.
Great, and it sounds like this research is going to be getting better moving forward as we, sort of hone in on and improve our modeling as well. So we just have a couple more questions and about 8 minutes left. Alexander was wondering if you are aware of any research looking at the cost-benefit ratio of specific post-fire treatments for sediment control and erosion mitigation.
It's a great question. So mulching or reforestation, I don't know of any specifically. Brett, do you know of any that have been done on post-fire?
Yeah, I could speak to that. I'd be curious to hear Brad Peel's take, or other folks as well. But we've done a lot of that analysis. Actually, we've used the same modeling framework of fire behavior modeling, and then linking the hill slope erosion with sediment transport through the stream network, but then putting active mitigation measures of post-fire mulching, sediment basins, straw wattles, reseeding, that kind of stuff. And that work informed a lot of, in 2020, Colorado had a lot of large wildfires, the Cameron Peak wildfire, East Troublesome, some of those. And our models, along with a consortium of other models, Brad actually helped round all that data up, and it informed where the mulching went on those fires. That one is less, we haven't written as many papers on that yet, and it's not as widely available, but I'd be happy to follow up further with folks. And there are, I know Pete Robichaud with the Rock Mountain Research Station and other folks have done a lot of cost benefit analysis and effectiveness of those treatments. So yeah, I don't know anything else to add, Brad, or anyone else.
Well, you've been calling on me, Brett, so I guess I should say something. We've been working on a lot of post-fire stuff and effectiveness. We're doing a lot of aerial mulching. And I think that one of the comments, getting back to some of the assumptions in your study, if you're just looking at planting, which is a long-term forest recovery, post-fire treatment, usually doesn't have an effect for a number of years, even decades. We're looking at trying to do immediate impact because that's when the erosion and debris flow hazards are highest. And so that's why, like wood mulch is really shown to be really good. And we've actually done some kind of going back to check. We're working with CSU and Rocky Mountain Research Station now, doing some sample watersheds, monitoring watersheds that we're mulching, some paired watershed studies, both in East Troublesome and Cameron Peak. And so that research will be coming out. So we're, intentionally mulching one little watershed and leaving the other one unmulched right next to it, and ones that need it. And so that'll be really interesting. I think one other comment, Kelly, is that the post-fire, I think we can come up with some better post-fire rehabilitation costs than you had. And maybe that's more recent that we've been able to do that. So that could be helpful. It would definitely increase the costs of those fires, but substantially. We're talking, tens of millions of dollars, probably potentially. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think we realized after the fact that 500 per acre is really low. So again, that sensitivity analysis, those results are probably more representative of the economic benefits we would expect from those proactive investments. So yeah, it'd be great to get those numbers for the next study.
And thanks for everyone for jumping in. But speaking of that next study, Jan Willem had one follow-up, less of a question, more of a comment. He said that typically lower elevation forest health is critical to ensuring water quality and also for snow melt water. However, snow does typically make up 65 to 80% of the usable water source. So we should be looking at both the source water area protection based on prime snow accumulation sites and their conveyance zones on the slopes lower down. So yeah, just moving forward, it sounds like there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
I guess I would keep agreeing with those comments. I think to be clear, we did model fire behavior and post-fire erosion in the high elevation snow areas. With this particular system, there's a lot of some high elevation reservoirs, and that go into pipelines and that go actually under the Continental Divide. And so those also potentially act as sediment basins. So all of the sediment in the high elevation can get trapped, and there can be complications, of course, if it gets in the pipelines and cross-boundary conveyance. But those were considered, and I think we should, that's interesting conversations with changing climate and changing precipitation patterns moving forward. We have to see how these are going to change and consider some new possibilities.
The monkey in the room that nobody really wants to talk about. All right, well, we have just a couple minutes left, so if it's all right with you guys, I'll throw out one more question. You mentioned in the paper that on-the-ground constraints in targeting lowered program efficacy or efficiency, and I was hoping that you could elaborate on some of those constraints that you identified.
Yeah, so it definitely wasn't the primary focus of this study, but there are definitely complementary reports, and Brett works very closely with the partnership, so I'll let him chime in as well. But there's been some summaries of these partnerships and some of the constraints faced just right when you have multiple actors with different priority values at risk. I mean, one example was highlighted in this study in this presentation is targeting the treatments just within the zones of concern, which might be the priority of Denver Water, right? If they got to decide where all the treatments went, but being in partnership with the Forest Service, there were also kind of ecological restoration goals that the Forest Service had, right? And doing treatments outside of those zones of concern. So there's certainly trade-offs there and constraints. In the broader literature, some of the summaries have highlighted things, you know, just working across different land tenure types, permitting requirements, right, are all realities. And then access, right, and finding people that can go into some of the more difficult areas, and then costs go up, right, in those areas as well. So there's those types of trade-offs and practical barriers. And Brett, I don't know if you know any particulars for this partnership and things they faced.
It's sort of this project and people knowing where the zones of concern are have instigated more NEPA planning in some of those areas, but still implementing in some of those areas has been challenging and getting through all the processes. And so, as Kelly pointed out, there's a pretty substantial amount of the funding and the treatments happened outside the zones of concern, and some even outside of the larger watershed boundaries that are the source water areas, because that's where the Forest Service was able to do projects. And so they said, we can do your money over here. So there are some benefits of keeping industry going, of building some workforce capacity and some other things like that. But it's a larger stretch to say that's a direct benefit to protecting source water if it's outside the watershed. So there's a lot of those on the ground constraints as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Kelly and also to Brett for joining us here in the Q&A. I appreciate both of you taking the time today, and everyone else, thank you so much for joining in and listening. If you have any follow-up questions or if you want to get a hold of Kelly, I put her contact information in the chat. You can also reach out to me if you have any ideas for future webinars or any questions about the consortium. So again, thank you, Kelly. It's been great to have you here today, and we hope to work with you soon.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.